When an empath absorbs the darkness of a narcissist and survives, Carl Jung discovered that they don't simply heal, they evolve into something the narcissist could never anticipate. The person who once carried every projection becomes untouchable. The soul that bore the weight of everyone's shadows develops immunity to manipulation. And most astonishingly, their mere presence begins to compel others to confront the very darkness they've been projecting. Imagine this moment. You've carried their rage, their shame, their emptiness, until you could hardly recognize yourself. You've been the emotional landfill for their unprocessed pain while they walked away spotless, leaving you to sift through the debris of their inner world. Then something changes, not in anger or chaos, but in a quiet, terrifying clarity. You stop explaining yourself to those who never truly listened. You stop absorbing emotions that were never yours to begin with. And most devastatingly, you become unreachable to their emotional crises. Jung called this process individuation, what I would call the birth of psychological sovereignty. The person emerging from this transformation is not the same one who entered the narcissist's web. It's a completely new archetype, one Jung believed could alter every relationship around them. But here's what few people realize about this metamorphosis. It doesn't arise from therapy sessions or self-help manuals. It comes through what Jung described as the night sea journey, a descent into psychological hell so complete that only the authentic self survives. The empath who endures this descent becomes what Jung once documented but rarely discussed publicly, what I call a shadow walker. Someone who has stared into the abyss of human darkness and returned with their light intact, yet irrevocably changed. Jung wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." The empath-narcissist dynamic is precisely this inferno, a psychological crucible that either annihilates you or reshapes you into something unprecedented. This isn't mere recovery. It's evolution, the kind of consciousness expansion Jung believed was vital for humanity's psychological progress. In their desperate attempt to devour your soul, the narcissist unknowingly becomes the catalyst for your highest transformation. They think they're breaking you, but in truth, they're forging you into something indestructible. Jung spent decades examining what he termed psychological types, and he observed something unsettling about highly sensitive people. They often become what I call shadow containers, unconsciously conditioned to absorb the psychic refuse that others refuse to confront. Jung once wrote, "The healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who become torturers." Yet empaths represent a third category, those who absorb torment without turning into torturers themselves. This, Jung explained, creates participation mystique, an unconscious fusion in which the empath can no longer distinguish between their own feelings and the projections they've absorbed. The narcissist exploits this vulnerability mercilessly, using the empath's sensitivity as an emotional dumping ground. But here's where Jung's insight becomes essential. He found that this very exploitation serves an evolutionary role. Jung wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown." The empath-narcissist dynamic forces this outgrowing in the harshest way imaginable. Consciousness evolving through trauma, psychological growth through crisis. The narcissist embodies what Jung called the denied shadow, the darkness they refuse to face within themselves. The empath becomes the vessel for this rejected shadow, and in bearing it, they begin to comprehend darkness in ways that transform their perception of reality. Jung believed consciousness evolves through conflict, and the empath-narcissist relationship is among the most brutal accelerators of that evolution known to psychology. The empath doesn't merely observe the shadow, they are compelled to carry it until they develop what I call shadow literacy, the ability to interpret psychological darkness as though it were a native tongue. If you've ever felt like you were carrying someone else's emotional burden, you've been their shadow container. Jung described this passage as the dark night of the soul, but for empaths entangled with narcissists, it becomes something even deeper, what I call the shadow immersion experience. You don't just witness darkness, you're forced to inhabit it. The narcissist's projections don't merely wound you, they rewrite your inner story. Their shame morphs into your self-doubt. Their rage seeps into your anxiety. Their emptiness manifests as your depression. You begin to absorb their psychological toxins until your sense of identity starts to dissolve. Jung called this psychological poisoning, writing, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Yet for empaths, this pain transcends the personal. It becomes collective. They process shadow material carrying the weight of generations of unresolved trauma. The narcissist drags you into what Jung referred to as the nigredo, the blackening stage of psychological alchemy where everything disintegrates into chaos. Jung observed, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. But to find that hidden order, you must first endure the collapse." Here's what Jung uncovered about this poisoning process. The psyche possesses its own immune system. When alien psychological material invades your consciousness, your authentic self begins developing what I call shadow antibodies, a subconscious defense mechanism that detects manipulation on an instinctive level. This is what makes the empath's transformation so profound. You don't just recognize manipulation intellectually. Your entire nervous system develops a visceral rejection to psychological toxicity. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." The empath who survives narcissistic abuse has made more darkness conscious than most people encounter in a lifetime. They become what Jung described as the wounded healer, though not in the conventional sense. Wounded by another's unconscious shadow, they heal by bringing that darkness into awareness. Jung noted, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed." This is exactly what happens to the empath who survives. They emerge with an unshakable serenity born from having faced the worst and lived through it. Jung studied what he called ego death, the collapse of the false self. For empaths entangled with narcissists, this death is especially excruciating, because their entire identity was built around being compassionate, understanding, and emotionally accessible. The breaking point isn't explosive. It's quiet, haunting. One morning you wake up and realize you no longer recognize the person in the mirror. Your empathy feels numb. Your hope, poisoned. Your trust, fractured beyond repair. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But at rock bottom, for the empath, there seems to be no self left to accept. You've absorbed so much of others' psychic residue that your true self feels buried alive. This is nigredo, the stage where everything that once seemed solid dissolves into formlessness. Jung observed, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." Yet acceptance feels impossible when you no longer know who is doing the accepting. You've spent so long navigating everyone else's inner worlds that you've lost touch with your own. But Jung understood something vital about this dissolution. He wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This choice only arises after the false self dies completely. The old identity, built on pleasing, adapting, and avoiding conflict, must collapse before the authentic self can emerge. Ironically, the narcissist, in their relentless assault on your sense of self, becomes the destroyer of your false identity. This is why I call narcissists unwitting shamans. They perform a kind of psychological dismemberment that triggers individuation, something even years of therapy might never achieve. Jung wrote, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." The narcissist pushes you so far into psychological nonsense that you are forced to rediscover your own sense. In this darkness, something ancient awakens. Jung called it the self, the archetype of wholeness that exists beneath all conditioning. The empath realizes they are not their trauma, not the emotions they've absorbed, not their compulsive giving. They are something infinitely more powerful. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For most, this remains a distant idea. But for the empath who survives narcissistic abuse, it becomes embodied truth, felt on a cellular level, because every false identity has been stripped away. Jung's fascination with alchemy stemmed from this exact realization, that the ancient process of transforming lead into gold was a metaphor for psychological transmutation. The empath's path mirrors what Jung called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature that forges something entirely new. What emerges from this inner crucible is no longer the same empath who entered the relationship. It is what I call the integrated empath, someone who retains their sensitivity but now shields it with impenetrable psychological boundaries. Jung described this metamorphosis through his concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to synthesize opposites into something original. The empath who survives has united their shadow and their light, their victim and their victor, their wound and their wisdom. Jung wrote, The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Yet here lies the crucial difference. The narcissist remains unconscious, while the empath becomes hyperconscious. This fusion gives rise to what Jung terms psychological sovereignty, or what I call shadow immunity. You become virtually immune to manipulation because you can now perceive psychological projections before they even touch you. It's as though you've developed night vision after being forced to survive in utter darkness. The narcissist's tactics that once shattered you now slide off effortlessly, not because you've grown hardened, but because you've become awake. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The transformed empath has dragged manipulation into awareness, and once seen, it loses all power. You now recognize the strings before the puppet show begins. But the transformation deepens further. The integrated empath doesn't merely resist manipulation. Their very presence destabilizes it. Jung described this as the constellation effect, where one person's heightened consciousness influences everyone nearby. He observed, "As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. The evolved empath becomes this light, not the naive glow that's easily consumed, but the fierce illumination that reveals shadows wherever it shines." Comment if you've reached that point where manipulation feels transparent and ineffective, the moment you can honestly say, "I see through the matrix now." Jung spent years mapping archetypes, the universal blueprints of human experience. Among them, he identified one that appears only after extreme psychological initiation, what I call the shadow walker. This is the one who has ventured into psychological hell and returned bearing forbidden knowledge. The shadow walker embodies the wounded healer, yet in a redefined form. They no longer heal through their wounds, but through their wholeness. Jung wrote, "Everyone you meet knows something you don't know but need to know. Learn from them." The shadow walker has mastered a lesson most people spend their lives avoiding: how to move through the darkest dimensions of the human psyche without being consumed by them. You become living proof that psychological sovereignty is attainable. Your very existence disrupts the unconscious agreements that keep others ensnared in dysfunction. Jung observed, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." That's why your presence becomes so unsettling after transformation. You've stopped participating in the collective unconsciousness that Jung identified as the root of human suffering. You've stepped outside the matrix of projection and illusion. Jung wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. The shadow walker has triumphed in this struggle. You've developed what I call tribal immunity, the ability to preserve your individual consciousness even amid the pull of mass unconsciousness. Yet this victory brings solitude." Jung referred to it as the loneliness of the individuated, the price of true awareness. He wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." But this solitude isn't empty. It's rich with an authenticity most people never touch. You come to realize that being alone with your true self is infinitely more fulfilling than being surrounded by those who only perceive your projections. Jung remarked, "To be normal is the ultimate aim of the unsuccessful." The shadow walker has transcended the need to be normal because they've discovered something infinitely greater, the power to be real. Jung discovered that such deeply individuated individuals become what I call consciousness mirrors, reflective presences that reveal to others the hidden dimensions of their own psyche. Their very presence compels others to see themselves clearly, often for the first time. The transformed empath becomes this kind of mirror. But unlike the passive reflection they once offered, showing others only what they wanted to see, they now reflect unfiltered truth. This triggers what Jung called projection withdrawal. When others can no longer cast their shadow onto you, they're forced to face it within themselves. For unconscious individuals, this process is excruciating. It explains why your transformation can provoke such intense, even hostile reactions. Some people will despise you for this mirror effect. They'll accuse you of being cold, distant, or insane. Jung understood this perfectly, writing, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but most people prefer irritation to understanding. Others, however, will be drawn to you like moths to a flame. They'll sense something different, a presence both magnetic and unsettling." Jung called this the numinous effect, when archetypal energy radiates through a human being. If you've noticed people treating you differently after your transformation, it's because, as Jung might say, your energy shifted, and everyone felt it. But perhaps the most profound impact is on other empaths still caught in narcissistic dynamics. Your existence becomes living proof that freedom is possible. That transformation isn't a fantasy, but a psychological reality. You embody the truth that no one must remain a prisoner of projection forever. Jung identified a powerful paradox in human development. True power doesn't come from controlling others, but from mastering yourself so fully that no one else can control you. The transformed empath embodies this paradox completely. They become deeply powerful precisely because they have no need for power over others. They've attained what Jung described as the treasure hard to attain, complete self-possession. Jung wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." The transformed empath lives this truth. Their boundaries aren't spoken as threats or ultimatums. They're simply reality. They don't declare their limits. They embody them. This creates what I call paradoxical magnetism. The more self-contained you become, the more others gravitate toward you. The less you crave their approval, the more they seek yours. The less available you are for emotional dumping, the more they respect your presence. Jung wrote, "Where love reigns, there is no will to power. And where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking." The transformed empath transcends the will to power through love, but love of self first. This isn't narcissistic self-absorption. It's what Jung called appropriate self-regard, the cornerstone of every healthy relationship. You can only give what you truly possess, and the transformed empath possesses something rare, an unshakable sense of self-worth. Jung observed, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." The empath who has endured narcissistic abuse is pushed into a radical kind of self-acceptance. Not the gentle, affirming kind, but the one forged through psychological fire. And here lies the deeper paradox. By refusing to be anyone's emotional dumping ground, you become available for real connection in ways you never were before. By saying no to manipulation, you make space for genuine love. Jung wrote, "Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness," and the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. The transformed empath understands this equilibrium on a visceral level. They can hold space for another's darkness without absorbing it. They become what Jung called a container, but no longer the unconscious sponge that soaks up everyone's psychological debris. They are now a conscious vessel, defined by clarity and protected by boundaries. Jung noted that certain individuals are called to what he termed the guardian function, protecting others from psychological predators simply through their presence. The transformed empath often embodies this guardian archetype, not through confrontation, but through unshakable inner limits that silently model what true psychological integrity looks like. Jung wrote, "To ask the right question is already half the solution of a problem." Your boundaries themselves become the unspoken question that compels others to confront their own psychological patterns. You turn into what I call a boundary beacon, living evidence that psychological sovereignty is real. Other empaths witness your transformation and begin to believe that their own liberation is possible. This guardian function operates through what Jung described as morphic resonance, the idea that one person's level of consciousness can elevate the consciousness of those around them. You don't have to do anything. Simply being authentically yourself becomes an act of transformation. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Yet for the transformed empath, these reactions are now conscious choices rather than unconscious compulsions. You decide which chemical reactions to engage in, guided not by others' needs, but by what serves your highest good. This discernment isn't cruelty, it's consciousness. Jung understood that indiscriminate giving often masks an unconscious addiction to being needed rather than genuine compassion. He once remarked, "Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research." For many empaths, this research phase can span decades, years spent unconsciously absorbing others' pain. The transformation marks the end of that research and the beginning of conscious living. You become a guardian not through words, preaching, or instruction, but through embodiment. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." Your transformed state naturally opens new possibilities for others. Not because you convince them, but because your existence alone becomes the living argument for psychological freedom. Still, Jung warned of what he called the integration trap, the danger of over-identifying with one's transformation to the point of rigidity. Some empaths, once open and porous, swing to the opposite extreme. Completely walled off, mistaking hardness for strength and isolation for safety. But true integration, what Jung called the union of opposites, requires balance. It means preserving both empathy and boundaries, openness and discernment, compassion and standards. The goal isn't to stop feeling, it's to feel consciously. Jung wrote, "Emotion, which is suffering, ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it." The integrated empath feels deeply, yet is consumed by nothing. They can witness another's suffering without absorbing it, offer support without self-sacrifice, and love wholeheartedly without losing themselves. This balance is fragile and demands what Jung termed constant vigilance. Old patterns of absorption and codependence will attempt to re-emerge, especially in moments of stress or vulnerability. But once you've experienced psychological freedom, there's no true return to unconscious servitude. The psyche has been rewired at its core. Jung believed that individual transformation inevitably ripples outward, catalyzing collective transformation. When one person achieves psychological wholeness, they become a living spark that ignites evolution in the collective mind. Proof that healing the self is, in truth, healing the world. Jung wrote, "The individual is the only reality." The further we move away from the individual toward abstract ideas, the more likely we are to fall into error. The transformed empath embodies this truth completely. Their personal awakening creates what I call consciousness ripples, waves of awareness that subtly elevate everyone they encounter. Their individual freedom becomes silent permission for others to seek their own. And this doesn't happen through teaching, preaching, or persuasion. It happens through embodiment. People begin to feel something different in your presence. Your energy itself becomes a mirror that invites reflection. Without words, you demonstrate that emotional abuse doesn't have to define anyone's future, that empathy doesn't require self-erasure, and that sensitivity and strength are not opposites but allies. Yet, as with all transformation, resistance follows. Some will attempt to pull you back into old dynamics through guilt, manipulation, or emotional emergencies. Jung called this the crab bucket effect, the unconscious urge to drag anyone ascending back into familiar darkness. But your transformation renders you immune to these tactics. You recognize them not as genuine cries for help but as projections of others' unresolved pain. If you recognize yourself in this journey, remember this truth. Your healing became your superpower. The empath who absorbs the narcissist's darkness and survives doesn't just recover, they evolve. They become an entirely new form of consciousness, something even Jung could only gesture toward in his writings. You become living proof of the psyche's indestructibility, evidence that consciousness can emerge even from the deepest shadow. That true power lies not in domination, but in self-mastery. The narcissist thought they were consuming your light. Instead, they forged it into something unbreakable. They believed they were destroying your empathy, but they only purified it into conscious compassion, the kind that cannot be exploited. Your transformation becomes a beacon for others still ensnared in psychological prisons. You show them that freedom isn't just possible. It's inevitable once one understands the inner mechanics of the psyche. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." Your journey through narcissistic abuse forced you to look inward so deeply that you uncovered the indestructible essence of who you truly are. That core, strong, whole, and luminous, was always there. The narcissist simply stripped away everything that was never authentically you. And now, standing in that truth, you've entered a new level of consciousness, one where sensitivity reveals itself as strength, empathy becomes wisdom, and your once fractured self stands as a unified, conscious being. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your superpower waiting to be activated through awareness. Thank you for walking this path of transformation. See you at the next level of consciousness.